Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear us okay. And I like the reference to Succession there, DC. That's a good one. It's an outstanding. If you haven't watched the final episode, get onto it. No spoiler alerts here. It's great to be here today. Just before we kick off, I'd just like the panelists to introduce themselves, and kind of what they do, if they're a VC, what their sector strategy is, and so on. So I'll kick off with Will. That's okay?
Super, yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Will Prendergast. I'm one of the partners with Frontline Ventures. We invest in European companies in B2B sector expanding into the US, and also in US companies coming to Europe on the way through to IPO.
Hey, doing? My name is James Brogan. I'm the founder of PepTalk. We're an employee engagement software company. We've offices in London, and I spend a lot of my time in the US now. We took on venture capital money late last year, so delighted to be here.
Hey everyone, Dan O'Toole from 8 Roads. We're a global VC with teams in US, Europe, India, China, and Japan. Generally, we focus on scale-up stage investing, which is for us kind of Series A through Series C, investing between $10 and $30 million upfront, and then trying to help with all areas of expansion post-investment.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy Neale. I'm a partner with Delta Partners here in Ireland. We're an Irish VC. We focus on the seed stage. We're deploying a fund right now in the Irish market, looking for seed stage opportunities. We're a generalist fund, so we look pretty much at all areas with a particular focus on B2B.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, let's get started. So I think, this whole topic is around board, and it's the relationship with the VC and the founder. But let's throw a tough question out there. Why have a board at all? I've met some great founders who think they know everything, don't need a board, want to get on with it. Board's in the way. Why are we having those meetings? So maybe I'll kick off with you, Amy, and just say, why have a board at all?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think actually over the past few years we might have seen scenarios where startup companies didn't have boards, despite taking on quite large amounts of capital that they were then charged with the responsibility of looking after. At its most basic level, a board has a fiduciary responsibility to look after the company, to do right by the company. That's kind of a base level, which of course is really, really important. But beyond that, the role of the board is to be supportive of the company. It's an additional team within the company that the CEO can lean upon to make sure that they're getting stuff done on behalf of the business. From my point of view, I would say this, but I think it can be incredibly valuable and a really, really important fourth wheel of any business.
That's great. Thank you. Will, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I guess there's some basic legal governance reasons why you need to have a board, but it could be very small and meet very infrequently. Often with venture-backed companies, the requirement to have a board is more related to the investment. So there's a requirement set that we must have a board and these people must be on it. So it's kind of like once you sign that agreement, that's why you have to have a board with those people on it. So you kind of sign up to that. Now, how effective it is, we'll probably get onto that a later point.
That, absolutely. James or Dan, even?
Yeah, I suppose from our perspective, we've gone through having a very sort of, let's say, a disorganized board to a more formal board in the last couple of years. And I think for me, the primary value is in being able to know, to lean on expertise that we don't have. The reality for most founders is you might be doing this thing for the first time and being able to lean into, in particular, obviously, people who are part of other companies. They've seen things happen. They've probably been founders themselves in many ways, a lot of the investment companies. So for me, just being able to have a rhythm around every quarter, every 2 months that you go in, and I know we're going to talk about maybe what's the best way of getting the most out of sessions, but I think at its heart, it's about getting other people into the team to ultimately win together. And once you see the board as been part of the team, I think you can start working together to make it that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, I'd say, building a little bit on what James is saying, I think there can sometimes be a tendency from founders to view it as an overhead, and it's just, I have to present numbers back to people, it's taking me away from the core of the business. I think you can view it more positively than that and think about it more as an opportunity to kind of take your head up out of the weeds a little bit, think about the strategy of the business and view it from 30,000 feet as opposed to, being on the ground as you are. So it's an opportunity to kind of lift your head up as a founder and then obviously lean on expertise of people around you as well.
So it seems like we're on a bit of a journey to try and take the entrepreneur mindset from this board thing I have to have because it's in my shareholders agreement to actually making it something that's valuable and usable. And I guess what that comes down to, presumably, is the composition of a board, right? So at the end of the day, if you're sitting around a table with people who can actually add value to you, you're probably going to get more engagement. You're going to use those sessions really wisely. So what do you think the ideal composition of a board looks like for an early stage company that's going through, a C to Series A stage, maybe high growth? What does it look like? And I'll kick off maybe with Dan.
Yeah, I think obviously composition will change as the company matures. I think like seed Series A, it's probably founders, maybe one or two investor directors, depending on how many rounds you've raised. I think at Series A and B, we often see independent directors being added to the board. So whether that be an exec chair or an individual NED who can bring a different perspective. It could be around a functional area, so they're expert in sales or expert in product, or it could be around industry expertise, someone who can open up their Rolodex in a particular industry and help to kind of, bring value in that sense. So I think starting off kind of very small and then over time adding some kind of outside expertise is generally how we see things going.
Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. It varies from stage to stage. At the early stage, I do think that there is also value in bringing in an independent individual or two into the board, particularly because of the functional requirements of the business at that stage. Realistically, a startup company at the earliest stages is going to be 1, 2, max 3 founders, and there's only so much that founding team can have in terms of expertise and skills, right? So an investor director may have operational experience, but more likely the value that they're going to be bringing to the board is pattern matching across many, many scenarios that they've seen in the past. So as well as what Dana said, I actually do think that an independent chair who's got some experience of building a business themselves or industry experience or knows the customer or the type of sale that you're doing can be hugely valuable even at the early stages, I would say.
How important do you think it is for that independent chair or person to actually have skin in the game, in terms of equity or participation on the upside? Do you think it's important or not?
I think I've seen both scenarios. In a well-functioning board, it shouldn't matter. The role of the board when they're working with an early-stage company is doing everything that they can at the right moments in time to make sure that company is successful. And I really think that both can work and it shouldn't matter.
Yeah. So just on that board composition piece, Will, would you like to?
Yeah, just if I could jump in, I think more important than skin in the game, I think, is true independence.
Yeah.
And perceived independence. So I know earlier in my career, we often used to introduce people as potential independent chairs. And even if they were truly independent of us, the perception from the founder always was, you introduce them, are they your person on the board? So I refuse to introduce candidates for chairs anymore because I just don't want to have to deal with that. So I say, you pick a chair, you need to trust them when the shit hits the fan. So pick somebody that you can really trust, that you've got no question marks over, so that you can really talk to them. And I think the independence is the and that you, like, as the CEO, that you really trust them. That'll become really important down the line. So make sure you kind of factor it in up front.
Right, yeah. Actually, James, you have a great independent chair. Do you want to talk about that journey, how you got him? And
Yeah, so our chair is a gentleman by the name of Larry Quinn, very seasoned technology entrepreneur. So we would have specced out the type of chair we were looking for, acknowledging firstly the weaknesses we probably had in our board at that time, which really was we didn't really had anyone who had the scars on their back, potentially had the success in terms of exiting a number of companies and the journey that, he'd been a CEO. So he, for me, has been a great mentor as much as an independent chair, and that element of trust that we built was huge. But also because he's independent, he's not afraid to call out when ultimately the CEO maybe needs to check themselves at times as well. So we would have spent probably 9 months getting to know each other before we even went and did it. And I think I would recommend that, to have the cup of coffee, to get to know the person as a person, as opposed to just, he's great credentials, let's just get him in, because once they're in, it's a different dynamic. So I think getting to know the person, not rushing into that decision, and certainly, personally speaking, it's been one of the best decisions we ever made as a company, bringing him in. And I think as the journey has gone on, he's added different value, but more value. And I think that's, because he's been on the journey himself, as your journey goes, he's almost maturing and growing with you, which I think is the sign of a really strong chair.
That's a really good thing. It's funny, I've seen a couple of scenarios where the chair and CEO relationship just hasn't worked out. And actually, in many ways, sometimes you assume if someone's ran a business, they're going to be a great chairperson.
Yeah.
But often those chairs actually want to run the business themselves, and there's a bit of a clash between the CEO and the chair. So I think that what you suggested, with spending a bit of time together in advance, and the part of that match, it's a marriage. It's not a date kind of thing. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And equally, Will, your point about who you refer, not being involved, being truly independent as chair makes a lot of sense. Dan, do you have anything you'd like to add to the chair discussion?
No, I think James's point is very valid, and I think it's also it can throw the dynamic when you introduce a new person to a board. It can, if your board is functioning well, you add someone else in. I think it's also really important that not only the relationship with the CEO is strong, but equally that this person is going to work well with the other board members. There's kind of a natural connection. They don't have to agree, obviously, but that these people can all work together, and it's not going to be a disruptive influence. So I think it's really, really important just to be very mindful and thoughtful about who you add to the board, and really, really dedicate the time. Like you said, it took 9 months to get to reach a decision. I think that's the right way to approach it, because it can be difficult to change the course once someone joins the board.
Amy?
Yeah, really interesting to hear James's point about the time. I do think that it takes time. It is like building a team, and I'd slightly disagree with Will that actually we would feel very comfortable making sure that we're introducing people from our networks. We have a vast network. For a first-time founding team, it can be very hard to access the individuals with the right set of capabilities. When you've invested in hundreds of companies, you've got a superb network to be able to actually make those introductions, but ultimately it needs to be a solid relationship between the CEO and chair. So fantastic to hear that took you 9 months, and unsurprising as well. Right?
Sorry, Will.
Can I pick up on something that James said about challenge? You said about the chair calling out CEO. I think for many people who are setting up their board, a lot of founders and CEOs dread the board. It's like, can I get through this? I just need to grin and bear it for 2 hours and then it'll be done. The best boards, like if you think about your own team within a company, all high-performing teams have challenge. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of yes people, and you never get anywhere. So, the best companies that are built everywhere, there's a lot of debate about what should go on. And that has to be replicated at the board. So if you're not comfortable setting up a challenge environment at the board, you're completely missing the point of the board. Like, it's both challenge and support, but I think the support thing is a little bit more obvious. But if you're trying to get into the no challenge zone by, let me walk through a long deck that I've laid out of my speaking points, and that's just going to absorb so much time, and there won't be time for questions, and then we'll just park a few things and say, I'll get back to you on that. It has completely missed the point. So you want to get into challenge zone fast. So that means short deck, summary, and try and get into Q&A. If you can actually make that happen, like you would in your own team where there's challenge, now you've harnessed the power of a board.
Yeah.
And as I said, like we can talk about support separately, but I think people shy away from challenge, whereas I think the good chairs even set it up for challenge. And they're kind of mindful that like you have to have trust going into that to be able to do that, but you got to get to challenge zone if you're going to get any value out of it, I think.
It's kind of uncomfortable for the entrepreneur, right? It's kind of like, if at a certain stage in life you've kind of ran everything, made every decision, and all of a sudden you're reporting to, inverted commas, this board with this chairman or chairperson. And I heard a great line once that actually a chair should manage the board and the CEO should manage the business, I think that having that separation of church and state makes a lot of sense. Curious to get your opinion on something I've seen a lot lately. I spent a lot of time in the States, in the US, and businesses, and we had the concept in the States of what we call executive session. Executive session was a session where all management and leadership were exited out of the room, and the non-executive directors had a conversation about the performance of the business. Do you see that happening in Europe? Do you see it more? Do you see value in it? Curious to get your opinion. Maybe start with Dan.
Yeah, so it happens. I think maybe in 50% of the companies I'm involved with, and actually there's probably a common thread of there being a US investor on the board who maybe has instituted that. So generally we'll have kind of a closed session at the end of the board, discuss how we think the meeting went, any kind of key areas where we feel maybe there's more work to be done or we didn't feel like there was alignment, and then report back to the CEO after, basically directly kind of give them the feedback, Sometimes it's about how they ran the meeting, topics, and then more often than not, it's about kind of key issues that we still feel need to be worked through. So I think it's quite valuable, and often, especially when there's new people joining a board, it can just enable there to be maybe slightly more open conversations that can then be fed back up to the CEO.
Yeah. Amy?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, the concept of the board can take up huge amounts of time for a founding team, which is time away from actually getting the core business done. And that construct is a really fantastic way for the chair to put structure on how the board and the company interact. And so also to get that alignment amongst the board and agree on an agreed position, and for the chair to then be able to feed that back to the executive team works really, really well. A structured board is a great board, and so whatever mechanisms that takes is really, really good. So, yeah.
I've never found it that effective. We do it in about half of our company. I've never found it that effective. Okay. I think the reason why is with most of our boards, we try to be like super direct in the meeting, and therefore there's nothing left to say at the end of the meeting. So maybe that's a bit too much challenge, but...
I think if this was Dragon's Den, I'd know who's going to be really direct.
But I think if you're going to do it, you got to do it like right from day zero, so that it's not, when it's implemented, it's not seen as like everybody's going off in the corner. And I think no matter how you structure it, there is always a perception of like, we had a board meeting, now I'm asked to leave. Why is everybody, what are they saying about me when I'm not there?
I'm an observer on James's board. Yeah. How would you feel about executive session?
Yeah, I know. For me, obviously, working with Venture Wave and getting to know Alan, Brian, and the team, there's been an element to getting to know each other, building that trust. But ultimately, Alan has been there, worn the T-shirt. I haven't to the same degree. So you got to open yourselves up to that, and can be pretty direct as well and getting to that point. And I think ultimately once we get comfortable in that challenge zone, then he's coming at it from the right reasons. He wants the company to ultimately succeed. So once you can kind of make your peace that he's not there to, this isn't personal. This is just, we're all here to ultimately try and bring the company to the next level. So I'm not sure, whether those sessions...
We'll have a chat about it after. But one thing I will say is that it's funny, it also soft, no, exactly. It all comes down to as well, if you look at a board composition typically, you might have multiple rounds of funding, lots of different VCs represented, some have directorships, some are observers and so on. And I suppose there's a combination of what the entrepreneur wants from those VCs. Do they actually want value add or not? Then the VCs themselves may prefer to be quite passive, as in, come to the meetings, how are you tracking to performance? Great, brilliant, all the best, I'm off. So there's kind of like this matchmaking piece that has to work, and you can't force one party to do the other, to do the opposite, if that makes sense. But I suppose one question I would have, and it's always a challenge, is when you start a business, you have a bunch of founders, and maybe they have a bunch of directorships because they were founders, and then you broaden the board, and the board gets much, much larger. How have you seen that shake out? Have you seen kind of situations where certain founders step off the board or stay on or have one representative? How have you seen as boards grow? Because as we know, companies go through the stages, they're going to grow, lots more voices, much more unwieldy to manage. So maybe, Amy, you could talk to that if you've seen it.
Yeah, so we're a seed stage investor, so we often have the advantage of being there when the board is being set up and at those earlier stages when things are small. And there's no doubt about it that a smaller board can be way more effective in terms of not just the governance role, but supporting on the strategic side as well. As boards grow, as people get added, I do think that there's absolutely the case that maybe all of the founders might have been present at the board at the start, and there's a real opportunity as the board grows for that to change. The role of the CEO changes, right, as the company evolves as well, and the role of the CEO and the board changes. So, I think that is really important to keep thinking about refreshing the board, thinking about the board, revisiting the mandate of the board for your company and what's right for your company over time. Yeah,
makes sense. Will, add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of investors specifically like to kind of hang on to the board for information or other rights. And that tends to result in, if you go through multiple rounds of funding, it kind of builds and builds. Generally, I think the bigger they get, the worse they get. For the size of companies, so they get outsized. So I think as founders, you should, to the extent possible, try and keep the board similar sized over time and kind of graduate people out of the board as you graduate up through the phases. So Generally, I see board size growing is typically a negative thing in my experience.
Yeah, interesting. Dan or James, any?
Yeah, it's like we generally invest at Series B, and the boards are significantly larger than what Amy would be investing into, and I think it definitely can dilute the value of the conversation when there's more people around the board. I think one of the things we've seen some of our companies doing is just trying to spend more time outside of the board environment with the board, building relationships socially. A couple of our companies just run board offsites where people get together for a day or two and just try and build those connections personally, and which tends to facilitate better conversations in the board. So while I agree with Will that as the board gets bigger, generally speaking, the quality of conversation probably reduces, there are kind of ways that companies and founders try and work with that and try and get the best out of what they're kind of dealing with.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, in many respects, the big question is, like, if someone is an ineffective board member, right, and maybe they're there for a long time on the journey, how do you exit them, or should you exit them, is the question? Or should they move to an observer stage? Should they move to some ambassadorial role? I mean, you obviously will. Your view is that the board shouldn't expand. So
it's pretty hard to remove people. Again, I think you can kind of face up to it and just like have that conversation and see if you can separate ways amicably. But that's pretty tricky. Mm-hmm. So, maybe you have to live with it and just not listen to what they're saying. There's no easy way of solving that particular problem.
Yeah. You just put their mic on mute. Yeah. Well, look, my final question is going to wrap up because we're 4 minutes now. One of the things, obviously, we all talk about the investing stage and coming into companies and so on, but obviously the big thing is the big exit. How do you exit a company? How important is board composition and board membership to the exit process of the business and actually preparing the business for sale? So maybe I'll start with you, Will.
Yeah. I think the board's main job in an exit process can be to make sure that the founders stay focused on optionality. So if there's an exit process going here with one buyer, like what is the alternative, so that as you get to the end, you're looking at kind of two alternatives and can judge it that way. So that's always what I see as my role. Like, we're not going to be helpful materially in a lot of the other things because you've built a functioning company, you've got everybody who's doing their job, and you've probably hired an M&A, and you got a lawyer. So it's really the board's job is to say, is this the right decision for all parties, and making sure that all parties are treated fairly on the way out.
Yeah.
And I think conflicts. The one thing about board that we haven't touched on, just take 10 seconds, is conflicts. Everybody on the board that's a shareholder is conflicted in some way. Just be aware of that at all times, and people who are conflicted and understand how to deal with that will typically make a comment like, I know I'm conflicted on this topic because I'm X, Y, Z, but here's my opinion. And often people who don't do that in scenarios might be around fundraising, or VC is advising a fundraising strategy that maybe works for them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If they don't preface that comment with, I am biased on this and you should probably ignore my opinion, but for what it's worth here, then you should kind of worry about that. Yeah. So sorry, I took it off.
No, it's a very fair point.
The exit process.
Yeah, I like to say at the beginning, I'm wearing my company hat today, not my VC hat. But Amy, would you?
Listen, we launched the fund last April. Okay. We've done somewhere in the region of 10 investments. I can't wait to get to the exit point on those companies. But yeah, I mean, more seriously, to Will's point, like, that's the most important thing, is that the board is there doing the best for the company when it comes to thinking about what that exit point's going to be.
As a whole, yeah. Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things we've done is because it's a pretty intense process for founding teams who haven't necessarily been through it before, we try and introduce them to companies who've been through an exit process just to kind of prep them for, I guess, the level of diligence that's coming, and also, to Will's point, trying to talk to them about strategy, maintaining optionality at all times, and ultimately getting to a decision point where you have multiple options. So yeah, there's limits to what you can do, but just trying to kind of leverage your network to, I guess, give as much value to the company as you can when they go through that process is kind of how we think about it.
Great. Listen, we've 20 seconds each. Your one piece of advice to a founder out there who's building their board.
Be really honest with yourself about what the gaps are in the business and use the board as a means to solve for that.
Thank you. Dan?
I think being pretty intentional about it from the outset. So, maybe as a seed founder, trying to think about what you want your board to look like in 3-5 years, and building towards that over time, and being very patient in who you choose to partner with, both VCs and independents. That would be.
For me, probably to try and give as much information in your board pack so as that when it gets into the board session, you're getting into the real strategic Q&A, you know, so you're not nothing the stupid question, but the more, if you give a very light deck, you're going to invite a lot of questions, where if you give a nice robust deck, then you're getting into, and ultimately you're getting the board to work with you. You know, if you want to create a team, you need to try and align around where the company is at and then move forward together. So taking the time, which I know is hard as a founder, to try and prepare the right materials, then you can kind of almost put them to one side and get into the meat of where the business is at and how we push forward.
Thank you.
100% this. That's exactly, and I think once you want to get into Q&A within 15 minutes at the start of the meeting and embrace the challenge. It's a positive thing, so get people to speak up and speak their minds.
So I think we've gone from a board that's been this thing you have to have to this amazing group that you'd want to have on your board. So I'd like to, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank Amy, Dan, James, and Will for their time. So please put your hands together. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.